Hello, bonjour, everybody. My name is Milena Audino. I'm the Business Information Officer here at the World Trade Center, Winnipeg. I would like to begin today's webinar with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are gathered on the lands of Treaty 1 territory and that Manitoba is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Innu, Dinesalune, and Dakota Oyeate nations. We acknowledge we are also in the homelands of the Red River Métis and that northern Manitoba includes lands that were and are on the ancestral lands of the Inuit. Manitoba Environmental Industries Association and the World Trade Center Winnipeg team respect the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledges the harms and mistakes of the past and present throughout our nation. Thank you for joining today's webinar, From Plan to Claim, the Role of Documentation in SR&ED Success, which will be presented by Andrea Legary in partnership with MEIA. So I would like to call on Jack from MEIA.
Thanks, Milena, and thank everybody for joining us. As Milena said, my name is Jack Winner. I'm the Executive Director for the Manitoba Environmental Industry Association. As such, we represent businesses in Manitoba that offer goods and services in the environmental sector, and that includes clean tech companies, but that also means that we're an advocate and promote our members and like to collaborate with organizations like the World Trade Center. Our other role is as a sector council. So in Manitoba, we have funding from the provincial government to provide workforce development and education and awareness. And we thought about this about a year ago to offer to our members and to all industry in general the opportunity to learn more about SR&ED claims. I had some experience with that in my time when I worked with industry, and in fact, I was a client of Andrea's way back when, and she's very experienced in this area, and I'm proud to have her present this to everyone here today. So, with that, I'll hand it back over to Milena.
Yes, thank you, Jack. So really quickly before we begin, I just want to mention a few housekeeping items. So number one, please send all your webinar questions directly in the chat box. So it'll be just at the top of your screen. And Andrea will try to answer as many questions as she can during the session, as well as at the end, we'll have a Q&A. Number two, for all logistical questions, you could send them in the chat box, and I will also try my best to answer as soon as I can. Lastly, you will also receive a PDF copy and recording of this presentation within the next week. And sorry, one more rule, solicitation of attendees is not permitted to protect the privacy of the attendees, as well as their attendance is not consent to be contacted. So let's kickstart this webinar. I would like to introduce you to Andrea Legary. So Andrea is the managing partner at the Recoup group, where she provides assistance to companies in a wide range of industries to access the scientific research and experimental development, so SR&ED tax credit, to fund the advancement of their technology. So prior to working in SR&ED, Andrea worked as an engineer, participating in several of Canada's leading space and defense projects. So welcome, Andrea. The floor is all yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So today's session builds a little bit off of the prior session we had, which was more of the 101 basics of what is SR&ED. And today we've called it the role of documentation in SR&ED. I do have my two of my colleagues here, but Miss Ren Gargan, she's a CPA with a tax background, and in SR&ED we often work as two halves of a whole. And so, you know, as the session goes on, if you do have questions and you do type them in the chat, you may see responses from the Recoup team. Not quite myself, as I'll maybe be focused on presenting. Today's session, I do want it to keep a little bit more interactive than the prior 101 session. So if you do have specific questions, feel free to type them in the chat, you know, or again, at the beginning here, if you would like to come off mute and share, that's fine with me as well. So I'm just going to share the presentation slides to start. So the disclaimer I'll make today, actually, with all SR&ED information, is that the information is provided for background only. A lot of SR&ED policy requires an analysis of your specific facts. specific to your claim fact pattern. And so therefore, again, these are provided as background only with references to the SR&ED policies so that you do have an understanding of where you can go and get more information. But a lot of these decisions do require on your claim specifics and your company specifics. And so careful not to misinterpret anything. My goal today is I'm going to talk a bit about the common mistakes made in SR&ED claims. So I do assume a little bit of that you have an understanding of what is the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Credit Program. And then walking through the process to make a claim, outlining that claim compilation process and what are the required documents to justify each step of that claim process. And then as we walk through that, highlighting the need and where there is a place to put in, governance and controls around how you manage your SR&ED program within your company. And obviously a key thing is providing that best practices for documenting your SR&ED. We're currently seeing increased audit levels of SR&ED claims. And, as a taxpayer, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We want to make sure that the tax dollars are going out in accordance with the program and to deserving and eligible projects. But what that does do is increase the need to that as you're doing the work, put the right documentation in place such that if you do receive a compliance review, that you have that appropriate documentation in place to prove that you've done what you said you did. So I'd like to start with a bit of a question out to the crowd. And so again, feel free to message in the chat, but, what are some of the primary concerns that you have around the SR&ED process? Is it how to set up a process to track SR&ED? Is it more in that core, how do I define what an eligible project is? Maybe understanding the costs, or are you concerned about what to expect in a review? Or even, how does SR&ED stack with other government funding? And of course, if there's other questions. So maybe give just a couple seconds to see if anyone is willing to share what their, primary concerns are, or maybe what they're hoping to take away today. No pressure. If we don't get anything, I'll continue forward with the agenda, but, feel free that, as we go through the material to, well, one, ask questions, but two, okay, excellent, cost eligibility and process of the claim. So that the presentation does speak well to that. So, but, as we go through, feel free to ask questions. And if there is an area where you'd like to dig a little bit deeper, we do have the time today. There is 2 hours for the session. And so it does allow us to maybe dig into some of these topics a bit deeper. Yes, that's great. Yeah, how to improve your reporting structure. There is nuances in who can claim the SR&ED, you as the performer or the payer, and when it's not your SR&ED to claim, there's still a great benefit to be provided to your client by documenting the SR&ED and the concerns and the process so that they can properly access the credit for your expenses. So I'll make note of that, and when we talk about contractors, can speak to that contractor documentation. So the CRA actually published a news release I think it was June 2023, about the common mistakes in SR&ED claims. And then we've added a few here that we commonly see, but some of the common mistakes that were coming up in CRA reviews was confusions about business type. And that's because your business type, whether you're a Canadian controlled private corporation or a proprietorship or a foreign owned company, that impacts your eligibility for the credit. What we often see is issues framing the SR&ED project at the wrong level. And so that can mean if we drive too far down into the project and we define the SR&ED at a lower level, sometimes it starts to look very routine because you have to follow. You're not supposed to solve it using routine practice, but you have to follow routine methods. So when you break anything too far down, it starts to look like routine engineering. And so framing the project at the wrong level, the opposite of that is we often see a lot of claimants frame their project at the business level. And so they're talking about the business objectives and the commercial challenges to achieving those. And the SR&ED has to sort of fit within that sweet spot of the science and the technology. Often there's, with the CRACs, is a lack of information related to the scientific or technological advancement. So just not a firm understanding of what is the knowledge that you are looking to achieve as a result of the experimentation. Obviously, a main thing that CRA would be looking at in the reviews is ineligible expenditures claimed, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the criteria for each of the expenditure categories today. Other financial assistance not disclosed. So if you receive payments from other Canadian companies for the work, if you're being paid for the work, or if you receive grants and incentives from IRAP, MyTax you have to pay into, but NRC, IRAP, the Manitoba Innovation Growth Program, etc. If you're receiving other grants and incentives, these programs can stack often with SR&ED if it's eligible work, but you can't double dip. And as all things SR&ED, that's a little bit nuanced, but we do have to just take that financial assistance into consideration in the calculation of our SR&ED. A lot of what we're hoping to cover today is the problem of a lack of supporting documentation. And then there's just the obvious of the CRACs, people who are submitting false information, making mistakes or incorrectly filling out the forms, and delaying and sending the information, or when the CRA phones to request a meeting. And at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about what that outreach process for a review would look like. Some people ignore their calls or don't return it in a timely fashion, and they will then close out. If they don't get an opportunity to speak with you, they will assume that the claim is unsubstantiated and therefore disallow the claim for SR&ED credits. So when you're making a claim, trying to break it down into digestible chunks, I would look at first determining your corporate eligibility. So are you as a company even eligible for the credit? Then identify the eligible projects, define the scope for those projects and the timelines. And then once you have, so step one in an audit would be, is there eligible work? So that would be in these two areas. And then once you have eligible SR&ED, then we look at what are the costs associated with that. So identifying the eligible costs. There are a variety of other factors that often get missed, such as the government assistance and funding, whether or not those expenditures have actually been paid in the tax year, etc. So we'll talk about some of those other factors that need to be considered. And then we prepare the SR&ED claim forms, integrate it into your tax return, and file a claim. And prepare for an authority review, but hopefully may or may not have to actually undergo a review. If you'll recall from the SR&ED 101, about 9 to 10% of claims receive an authority review in a period. So step one being corporate eligibility, the basic requirements, and we covered this a bit in the 101, is that you carry on business in Canada, that the SR&ED that you're claiming for is related to your business. So that, if you are a distributor of clothing, you can't have a SR&ED project looking at canola breeding. There's a requirement that the research you are performing is related to your commercial business. That expenditures are incurred. And I know that seems obvious, but it's amazing how often we will speak to claimants where they have a really great project and then we get down into the weeds and it's like, well, no one actually took a salary. Some people did it, did services in kind, other businesses they're working with. And so fundamentally, they're just like, was not actually a cost that was incurred. That the SR&ED activities are conducted in Canada by or for you. There's a minor allowance for some labor to be accomplished outside of Canada, but by and large, all of the expenditures have to be incurred here in Canada and the work performed here in Canada. And you have to file a completed claim by the reporting deadlines. So that's 17.5 if you're filing as a proprietorship, 17.5 months, sorry. You have 18 months from your taxation year completion to file a claim as a corporation. Why this matters, so there's a different, your business type matters, is Canadian controlled private corporations, CCPCs, under the current legislation are eligible for a refundable investment tax credit at the federal level of 35%. So that means whether you owe taxes or not, you will receive 35% of your qualified SR&ED expenditures back as a refundable tax credit, so cash back to you. And that is subject to an expenditure limit, which I'll briefly mention on the next slide. But other corporations, individuals, partnerships, and trusts, they may be eligible, but they are receiving a non-refundable investment tax credit. That being that if they owe taxes, it will reduces their taxes owing. If they do not owe taxes, they can either carry it back 3 years or carry it forward 20, but they don't actually receive cash back if they don't owe taxes. And that's why it's so important to make sure that your type of entity is properly stated. So to receive that 35% refundable credit, we have to be a Canadian controlled private corporation. And this, a lot of us, that's sort of accountant speak. And so that can be found out by looking at the jacket of your tax return. On the front page, there's this box where it says, what is your type of corporation at the end of the tax year? And this would have been determined by your corporate accountants. There's also, in order to receive the full, you're allowed to receive up to $3 million of expenditures at that 35% rate. In order to get that full $3 million, the prior year taxable capital employed in Canada, again, kind of technical accountant speak, but it's just important to know to even ask these questions of your accountant. But the prior year taxable capital employed in Canada of all your associated companies must be less than 10 million. And then we earn that credit on the qualified SR&ED expenditure up until the $3 million. And when your group's taxable capital exceeds 10 million, your $3 million gets ground to zero once taxable capital reaches 50 million. So if you're right in between 10 and 50 million, you would be allowed to claim up to 1.5 million of expenditures at that enhanced rate. But the key takeaway here is not that you have to become an accountant to understand the program, but understanding that the type of corporation you are does have an impact, and that it's important to have an understanding of what that is. So it's important to work with your corporate accountant to understand your business type. It's also important to understand your taxation years. So sometimes when you have a change of control of the corporation, there might be a stub period or a taxation year that occurs, and people sometimes miss that. So where your taxation year is normally December 31st, if due to a sale or a change in business ownership, you have a stub period of, let's say, October 10th, 2004, every tax return that has to be filed, the SR&ED claim has to be filed for that period. So changes in ownership may create an additional SR&ED return having to be filed within that year. If you are Canadian controlled, it's important to understand if you're associated to other entities for SR&ED purposes and the implications of that, as you do share that limit. And what this might look like in a CRA review is you may be asked to substantiate your status as a CCPC and provide the names and addresses and SIN numbers of the individuals, corporations, and trusts that hold ownership in your corporation. So provide that share register. You also might be asked to provide your group organizational chart to understand the relationships between the companies. Does anyone have any questions about business type? I know that one's a little bit technical, but it is an important first step, as sometimes, if you are operating as a proprietorship or a partnership, the value of the credit is substantially impacted before you even get started about what's eligible or not. So if not, we'll move to step 2. So this is really identifying your eligible projects. So step 1, and this is usually the first step that we do when we're working with claimants, is to say, go with that initial understanding of what is SR&ED. And I'll talk a little bit about the eligibility criteria here, but when you have a general understanding of that, you have to have an uncertainty, there had to have been experimentation, and you have to have learned something. Just with a very rough understanding of that, go and conduct an inventory of all your research, innovation, and engineering projects where those factors may be met, and make that list. And then work to screen these against the SR&ED eligibility requirements. And there are the CRA policies, which are the ones that we find online. But it is important to note that the law is actually the income tax definition of SR&ED. And there are interpretations by the courts of this law, which can be found in old or in previous published tax court cases around SR&ED. And that really sets precedents for what may or may not be eligible. And what's valuable about looking at prior tax court cases, and there are a lot of great resources if you just search SR&ED tax court cases, where there's multiple court cases on one website where they provide backgrounds on what they are with respect to. But you sometimes can find court cases that deal with the specific industry that you're in. So an example of that is there's a SR&ED tax court case that was published in 2023, which I believe the company was called Canfric, but they make shepherd's pies and other food products, quiches, etc., for Costco and Loblaws. And so they had claimed SR&ED in association with a goal to reduce the salt and fat content of their products without impacting the taste. The CRA audited them and rejected that, and then they did go to tax court and ultimately have that finding overturned. And so in looking at those court cases, you actually can get some examples of projects that have been claimed and how the court assessed their eligibility, which can sometimes even be more valuable in understanding how the law is applied than just looking at CRA's policy and guidelines. The important thing to note, though, is in an audit, the CRA is bound by their policies and their guidelines versus if you were to get into a SR&ED controversy type situation where you were issuing a notice of objection or appealing to the Tax Court of Canada. That's where they are governed by the laws and that precedent set by the court. So you still have to take those interpretations and take the law, and when you're defending your claim, speak in CRA SR&ED policies. But there often is alignment, and it's just about finding that alignment. So when you're evaluating the projects, we did talk in a bit more detail about the eligibility requirements, but the current CRA policy is that the projects must meet the how and the why criteria. And that is the purpose of the work, the why behind the work being performed is to advance scientific knowledge or to achieve a technological advancement. And how the work was performed was a systematic investigation or search. And so your business project might exist at one level, and then the SR&ED experimentation or the SR&ED project may exist slightly different at a slightly different level. And what that might look like is a software project where in its entirety, I see John's question. Ren, you might be able to provide the link to the SciTax website for SR&ED courts. But so for the why and the how, in a software project, you may have a commercial project which involves the development of the full software system. And then the SR&ED, the how and the why, the technical challenges might be at a lower level of building out, let's say, an algorithm within the system. So the SR&ED project, if the technological uncertainties only exist around the algorithm development, what that might mean is we can't necessarily claim all of the components of the commercial system. And so the SR&ED project, the work around why is it being accomplished has to be for that to address your scientific uncertainty. And so work in that example, if you are trying to attach a payment module, of ultimately, because it's a commercial product, you have to be able to collect payments from your clients. That work to add a payment module might not be eligible for SR&ED, whereas your other system development, anything that's linked back to your uncertainties could be. Previously, so the CRA policy, this has been in place since August 2021, the why and the how. Previously, CRA policy from 2015 to 2021 asked the 5 questions, and it required reviewers to answer yes to each of the 5 questions. And these were driven out of a Northwest Hydraulics versus the Queen court case back in 1998. And why I mention them here is that the CRA review manual for audits, and which is the rules that the auditors are to follow, still makes reference to the 5 questions and still requires the auditors to answer yes to each of the 5 questions to approve the eligibility of a project. So the questions were, is there a technical risk or uncertainty? And in policy that got stated as, was there a scientific or technological uncertainty that could not be removed by standard practice? Secondly, did the effort involve formulating hypotheses specifically aimed at or reducing and eliminating that uncertainty? Was the overall approach consistent with a systematic investigation? Was the approach for the purpose of a scientific or technological advancement? And then was a record of the hypothesis tested and results kept as the work progressed? Generally, what I've found is if we can answer yes to the first three, the advancements just sort of fall into place, because if you had a valid uncertainty and you did an experiment to address that uncertainty, you will have learned something. And that is all an advancement is advancing your knowledge of how or why something behaves the way it does. And so that one usually falls into place. And then was a record of the hypothesis tested? This is where it's the documentation, and how we'll talk about what types of documents to keep, really comes into play, as while you may have done very eligible work, if you cannot substantiate what work you actually performed, what tests were performed, what was the data collected, what were your findings, ultimately you haven't advanced the knowledge base of the company, because sort of that, if the person who did the test got hit by a bus, it would no longer exist in your corporate domain. And so there is a requirement that there is documentation kept throughout the process. So these questions, while they're no longer in the actual eligibility guidelines for the CRA, I still think they're valuable in assessing which of your projects would potentially be eligible for SR&ED. And one of the keys we often see is we can often have companies define really great scientific and technological uncertainties. So on day one, what are all the things we don't know and why are there gaps? But then when we look at what they actually did, they're actually not resolving or testing those specific uncertainties. And I do have some examples of how I would articulate scientific uncertainty in a few slides. And so when we talk about those, I can point out a little bit about how you could have a really great uncertainty, but if ultimately you haven't designed a test to actually address that, the CRA may find issue with the project. So when you're identifying these eligible projects, the types of documents that you want to rely on and keep copies of are any of the meeting minutes and decisions that were made. When we say something is uncertain and there's risk in the project, it's great if those risks are documented and communicated to the corporate leadership. Again, that's a great indication that the risk and the uncertainty exists, and that all of the project stakeholders understand that that risk is being undertaken. Ideally, identifying whether something is SR&ED or even potentially eligible for SR&ED, the earlier in the project life cycle, the better. And that is because then we can make sure that we are properly documenting each of these decisions, tests, and findings. And sometimes when everything goes well, it's hard to look back and identify those uncertainties, but if you've done it up front, then even if you are successful in your tests and things work out, the first experiment, you still have that document trail to suggest that on day one, you did not know what the outcomes were and there was uncertainty, and it supports the eligibility of the project. It is important, while you don't have to prove that no one in the world has solved this problem, they do expect that you've conducted a review of generally available information in the public domain. I would recommend going to Google Scholar and doing searches for literature that might guide your process. Search conference proceedings in the industry that you're looking to advance. When you're in software, there's often blogs or other support groups for, let's say, Salesforce, et cetera, where they talk about, certain challenges in working with portions of the system, or even patents. And it's important that when you're doing that, to identify the gaps that you're finding. So it's really great that at the outset of a project, if you could show how in literature recently published where others are working on the same problem. Right now in machine learning AI, you likely could pull publications that say dealing with large unstructured data sets presents a challenge and a bit of an unknown, and that we're not sure exactly how each of the models behaves under these conditions. So having a literature reference, while not mandatory, really helps support your case. And you can even make those literature references in your technical description. So I would keep documenting on what is the state of the art when your project started, what's the company's existing knowledge base, what documents did you refer to, and what industry professionals did you speak to? So we sometimes see the example in software, but otherwise of where, maybe you email the engineers at Salesforce and they say, well, no, there's absolutely no way you can accomplish this on our system. And yet you still proceed with your own hypothesis of how to make that work. Similarly, that could be, in a materials project of where the manufacturer of the material says, no, like we haven't designed it with that application in mind, and therefore we have no data on how it will perform in that specific environment. Maybe that's the cold of the prairies. And so they might say, no, we've only ever tested it in this operational range. And if you're going to use it outside of that, we can't guarantee the performance. So having that email or indication from the manufacturer or whoever you spoke to becomes supporting documentation that there's a gap in the available knowledge in the public domain. The other thing that I must have deleted off the slide to make them have less content on them. But one of the things this can look like is having a bit of a matrix of the product you're trying to develop versus competitors' products. So if in fact it is a product that you are trying to develop, but where are there gaps in this? If it's a software, maybe the scalability, or looking at all the making a matrix of the available technologies against your requirements and showing where there's gaps in the available technologies and achieving that, so that if you are saying, no one makes material that performs in this way, that you've shown how your material performs beyond what's available in the standard practice. So the next step, so documentation requirements. So again, in addition to documenting what is the state of the art, that we should be able to then articulate and document the technological or scientific uncertainty for that project. So documenting right on day one, what are your technological unknowns requiring experimental development, and state what are the specific uncertainties to be addressed via experimentation. And then it is important to identify your intended technological advancements. But like I said, if you have a really good uncertainty and you design an experiment to test it, you will develop knowledge. And so the advancements really are that. It's just the knowledge that you've developed. And then this is a statement right from policy, but the type of knowledge in the context is conceptual knowledge, such as theories or prediction models, rather than just factual knowledge. So that being, if your uncertainty is, I need to use this material, I don't know what the hardness is, and all you have to do is go out and measure the hardness of the material, then you have just, collected data to solve your uncertainty, that you haven't really advanced the knowledge in that area. So that would not qualify, versus, while it sounds really bold to say theories and prediction models, it starts to sound like you really do need to be able to write your PhD thesis on this. But what it can look like is, I don't have any data of how this material will behave in this certain temperature exposures. And then now we have an experiment of incrementally exposing it to different temperatures and testing the material behavior. And so you now have, while I wouldn't say, like, it's sort of a little bit bold to call it a prediction model, but you essentially have an understanding of how does X correspond to Y, that you can almost chart out, and you could say, the hardness of the material is linear to temperature. And so it becomes a bit of a prediction capability that, while you may have only tested 0 to 40 degrees Celsius, that based on the trend, you could start to infer what the behavior of that material would be over or below the tested ranges. And so that's what they mean by that conceptual knowledge being developed. So I have a few things here, and I will sort of pause here. So as I provide these examples, if you have, specific questions, because, this is where a lot of the nuances is in this defining what is uncertain. But these are, I just had ChatGPT help me out with some potential projects, and then using those to then articulate what an actual scientific or technological uncertainty might be. So whether a new high-speed bearing design can operate effectively with minimal lubrication in a non-standard atmospheric environment, so extreme cold or vacuum conditions. And why is it uncertain? Because existing tribological models are inadequate and new testing must be conducted to understand the performance under varied conditions. So in addition to saying what is uncertain, we should also say why it's uncertain. What is the knowledge that's missing in the public domain? And so again, from a materials perspective, that might be, I can look up tables, or I can look up, the manufacturer can give me this data, but this other piece of data is just unavailable. And the only way to get it would be to perform an experiment and develop that understanding of how those variables relate to each other for ourselves. So another example could be whether a machine learning algorithm can accurately classify data in real time under high volume streaming conditions without degradation of performance. And so why is that uncertain? The interaction between the system throughput, memory usage, and algorithm precision is not well understood and requires iterative experimentation. And you can see that when you have a good uncertainty, it sort of lends itself to what is the advancement? The advancement will be that I've gained knowledge on the interaction between system throughput, memory usage, and algorithm precision, so that it kind of answers themselves, like that link between the uncertainty and the advancement becomes very apparent. So a final sort of example, tried to give three, sort of different areas of technology, but whether a laser welding process can reliably join dissimilar metals without creating brittle intermetallic compounds. And so the process parameters and metallurgical behavior are not well established. Experimentation is required. So again, often for these types of projects, if you were using similar metals or standard welding processes, there will be tables that you could rely on, and because you're seeking to do something that's a bit non-standard using dissimilar metals, that data of what's the heat, dwell time, temperature, all of those things might not be readily available to you, and that you would have to do some experimentation. So what I'd like to point out here is, again, on day one, if these are your projects, we might be able to make these really great statements of what's uncertain and why. But where the eligibility of the project might fall down is when you actually go and do the work. If instead of conducting a controlled experiment, for example, on what are the different process parameters and how do those correlate to the behavior of the metal, if instead you just set up a trial, do one or two different things and say, yes, that worked, and not actually trying to understand what is the relationship between each process parameter and the outcome, it potentially would be ineligible work. And so that is one of the nuances that often companies struggle with in trying to decide about the eligibility of their projects, in that they can hear, their competitor had a successful shred claim for a project and they're doing something very similar. And so they feel that it also could be eligible, but how you do the work is equally as important. And so having a controlled experiment where you actually are developing knowledge on the relationship between these parameters and outcomes versus a binary, I made 3 different options and one worked the best. We picked that one. We're going to use it from now on, and not really understanding why the behaviors are happening. That would be considered an ineligible project. I know uncertainties is a really nuanced thing. Does anyone have any specific questions around defining an uncertainty in their project, or maybe a specific area of science that I haven't addressed? That they'd like to have an example? Okay. So, and we can feel free to type if something comes to mind, but once we have, so what that would be the end of, documenting what potential projects that you want to consider. Once we have that project list, then we got to define the scope of the actual SR&ED project. So the SR&ED project consists of all of the interrelated activities necessary to resolve your uncertainties. And it begins when work is initiated to achieve that advancement in face of the uncertainty. And that's where documentation becomes very important. So your initial literature search may or may not be eligible. If you do your initial if on the day one, you're not sure if there's information in the public domain, and then you do that literature search and you find a solution available to you, that obviously would not be a SR&ED project. If on the other hand you're in a cutting edge or, bleeding edge area of technology or development, and so, any reasonable person would know that the information out there is not going to be sufficient to solve your problem, then your initial literature search might be performed for the purpose of refining your hypothesis and finding some known facts to, refine what will your starting point be, in which case that initial literature search would be eligible as part of your hypothesis development. And so that's where it really is important when you're embarking on a project to sit down and make a list of what are the things we don't know, what are the risks in this project, and have that, even if it's just an email to yourself with a date, that can really protect when did the SR&ED project begin in an audit, so that you can communicate, on this date is when I was aware that there was uncertainties here and that there was a gap in the available knowledge. And the SR&ED project ends when that uncertainty is resolved. And that can also involve in abandoning or discontinuing your investigation. But it is often different than when your business project is complete. And so, in a mechanical engineering project where we might make an alpha prototype, we might make a beta prototype, and then we might move on to our pre-production prototype, where instead of looking at our scientific and technological uncertainties, we're now looking at what's the manufacturability of this. And so your SR&ED project would likely end when you stop asking your science or technology questions, and it would no longer be a SR&ED question, and your pre-production unit might be ineligible and viewed as for a commercial purpose. And now I say may, because there may be SR&ED in developing a process for the manufacturability of that unit. And so again, you have to challenge yourself on, has the uncertainty concluded, and what is the purpose of the work? So what is the purpose of building prototype 3? Have we shifted to a sales demonstration? Have we shifted to, like I said, manufacturability? Is it just, where do I put a screw? How do I remove pinch points? Like, have we shifted to addressing commercial problems to make sure that we can sell this product? Or are we still addressing the fundamental science and technology question? And so again, documenting at each stage why you've done the work that you've done is really what can help you defend your SR&ED endpoint. So I have seen in audits where the CRA says, no, after that first experiment, you resolved all your technology and science concerns. And I think that the second prototype was, for the purpose of, having more of a commercial sample to shop around to get customer feedback. And so being able to show why prototype 2, what exactly the purpose of it was, and what was the data and the testing being collected, having documentation of that is really what would make the difference in an audit of being able to support that additional work and the duration of the SR&ED claim, or where you may end up, only being allowed to claim a portion of the work. So it is important to differentiate from routine engineering or troubleshooting. So sometimes we face technical problems, but that they are solved with routine engineering. I had a discussion this week with a company in sort of the food processing area where we were talking about potential eligibility for process developments. But a lot of their work was more looking into the industry, looking to equipment manufacturers and putting in place best practices. And so while there was a bit of uncertainty of how that would impact their throughput, how it would impact their product quality, is there a benefit to introducing these best practices? There really isn't a technology advancement. They're really just putting in best practices and raising themselves up to what's already considered the baseline technology for their industry. And so being able to differentiate, you may still need to do some iterative engineering to get things to work, but you're not necessarily developing new technology or resolving an uncertainty. once you're in as part of defining your SR&ED project, that you have that uncertainty, generating your hypothesis to serve as a starting point, and then planning out a structured and controlled methodology specifically aimed at testing the hypothesis, and then documenting each step and decision-making point. So the terminology the CRA uses is that they require a systematic investigation, and that really is that iterative process of experimentation. I often say, think grade 6 science project. So having a theory or an idea that you conceive, that your experiments are conducted specifically to test this idea, that there's actual measurements made and recorded, and that you're controlling it back to you're comparing the results back to either a control group or a standard. Such that often what we ask our clients for is like, what's the quantifiable? So, I achieved a 30% increase in whatever, or a 30% decrease in scrap, or I improved in software, a 30% increase in decrease in response time, etc. So having a quantifiable is a really good sign that you're comparing it back and that it's controlled research. And that your hypothesis evolves. So it's sort of based on what you learn in the first iteration, what is the next proposed concept or design, and then how is what you're learning through testing helping to evolve that. And your investigation continues until your uncertainty is resolved, and that is when the SR&ED eligible work ends. So when you have a SR&ED project, your support work is also eligible, and that can be the engineering, design, operations research, math analysis, computer programming, data collection and testing, and even psychological research. So this support work, this is where these activities are not necessarily SR&ED on their own, but when you have an eligible uncertainty, the engineering or the testing or the data collection as part of that project are eligible support work. So understanding when you have contractors who are participating, only these 8 categories are eligible as eligible Canadian contractors from taxable suppliers. And psychological research often throws people for a bit of a loop. And at the beginning of my SR&ED career, I didn't see a lot of it. But what I see a lot of now is that human-machine interaction. And in software, that can be that user interface reaction, or in automation, like human in the loop as part of the control system. And so while we might not think of that as psychological research, if you're doing testing to understand the behavior of the human and their ability to react to the technology as part of the control loop, or how the technology is changing their behavior and having them respond, that if it links back to the technology itself, that can be eligible support work. So this is just an example. One of the challenges, I think, with SR&ED is that there is no one size fits all in how to document or express this. But, if your process involves different prototypes, this is just sort of a very elementary type document of how you might want to choose to document those different phases so that you're able to then articulate them in your SR&ED write-up. But, having this at the beginning, you might estimate your start and completion dates, but as you go through the year, putting in a firm, what day did the phase 1 work start? When did it stop? What are those requirements and the objectives that I'm trying to achieve? What are the constraints, risks, dependencies? I often say this is the what keeps you up at night list. And often as engineers, those don't make the cut into our presentations to management. We often say, yes, you need me to achieve X, Y, and Z, and we'll be done in 3 weeks from now, and it'll cost $50,000. We don't say, but if this material can't withstand this temperature, the whole project's going to collapse. And so those constraints, risks, and dependencies, because they often don't make it into what would be considered normal business documentation, it is really important that if we know the project's going to be potentially SR&ED eligible, that we're documenting those in some way, even if it is just in someone's notebook, internal emails, or in like a defined sort of SR&ED document that you keep. It's it's important to document what work was performed. And so if these are different experiments on your alpha prototype, like how was the experiment conducted? What was the number of test cases used? Where did you get that test case data? In software, was it just a bench scale sandbox environment, or were these live operational tests? And so documenting how and what work was performed and how was it performed, and then how did that change over each of the phases? Again, just a rough and quick example of how you might frame that out for your own documentation, and then how that could be given to the CRA to explain that process. So when you're defining your SR&ED project, we are allowed to have multi-year projects. So the CRA does recognize that work might start in 1 year and you might not address your uncertainties for multiple years. But how you must claim the work and file them separately for each taxation period. And so what that often looks like when we look at the SR&ED documentation, the technical description has what are your uncertainties, what work was performed, and what were your advancements. That what are your uncertainties, that description might hold true for multiple years. You might have to tweak it based on as your hypothesis evolves. So might your uncertainties or your understanding of the uncertainties. But that first portion of the project description might hold true for multiple years. But what activities are performed in the taxation year, that must be claimed for each separate taxation year based on the eligible activities and the cost incurred in that specific period. Also, even if you've had an audit and a project was accepted in the past, that doesn't guarantee that project will be accepted in the future, as each year's work must demonstrate ongoing uncertainty. And that's where the CRA might say, on your third year, where you're developing your third version of the prototype, they may say, we feel that you've addressed your scientific technological uncertainties, and that the purpose of this prototype is more commercial. And so each year you have to be able to prove that there's still ongoing uncertainty. And it's important to be conscious that the information available in the public domain and even your own internal knowledge base is growing as the project progresses. And so you need to have a little bit of a gut check each year of, are these uncertainties still valid? What information is available in the public domain? How those still remain as gaps in the public knowledge. Clearly outline in your description how the current year activities build on unresolved uncertainties or the hypotheses from prior years. And it's important that you divide the work between the years very clearly. And so, often, the worst thing is if in an audit you start describing work that, let's say you're a January to December taxation year and you're describing this really great experiment, and then they say, hey, can I have some documentation, when in fact it occurred in December 2022, the month before the tax year started, and then it's outside of the eligible period. And then that can impact the eligibility for the entire period if they do decide that work was when you resolved your uncertainties. So in documenting your SR&ED projects and your project scope, it's really important to understand, month by month, what work was accomplished so that you are describing the activities from that specific taxation period. The documentation requirements, it really can, this is where, nothing's sort of off the table. It can be your napkin with your drawings, maybe throw a date on it or take a picture on your smartphone so that you have a dated photo or video of when that took place. But it can be in your project plans. It can be, how you designed your experimentation, your project notebooks, records of the different runs that you took, meeting minutes, test protocols, etc., photos and videos, emails to contractors, and grants application and reporting. So if you do have IRAP in your monthly reporting your activities, that can be a great source of documentation for the chronology of the work. There's no standard for the documentation, in that what the CRA is looking for is to prove that you've actually done what you said you've done. And so an email to yourself at the end of the day of, I tested 4 materials today, here's their data sheets, here's what we saw, we used this temperature, this process, like that would meet the requirements. We do not need to have formal test plan signed off by 5 different personnel, and, like with a document control process, etc. That obviously would be maybe the gold standard, and in many regulated industries is the standard, but that isn't necessarily a firm requirement. And I'd say the most important thing is that you actually have evidence of what was done and when it was done. And so what I often see fall down is where project meeting minutes or reports where there's no date. It's a Word document with no date and time, no author recorded, and it's not been emailed out. So again, even if the document doesn't have a date, if you emailed it out to the team to say, hey, here's the results, or hey, please review, that email then itself becomes time-stamped, dated evidence of the work. Before we go in, so the next steps, step 4 is we're going to start talking about the costs and then some of the rules around each of those costs in the document to keep around that. Does anyone have any further questions around just sort of the projects and framing out that systematic investigation? Okay, you guys are just gonna take the information from the fire hose. I'll just keep talking, but please do not hesitate to ask if you do have any questions. So once we have those eligible projects, the more fun part is what are we getting back? What are the costs that we're eligible to claim? So the most lucrative cost category and often the most common is the labor. So your internal labor costs for the shred performed in the year. And this is really the salaries or wages of the employees directly engaged in shred. And that's important as often some people are only paying themselves dividends as owners, or they are, paying they view people as employees, but they're actually paying them via invoice or another methodology. Employees and salaries and wages for the CRA for shred labor must be T4'd salaries for which CPP and EI have been paid, if applicable. And they're calculated with consideration to the shred portion of the wages. So your total hours worked on your shred project, ideally tracked, and we'll talk a little bit about time tracking, over the total hours worked, and then times the wages paid. This is where, so for each of these cost categories, we've provided a link to the policy. And if we haven't, there is a specific policy. So if we haven't provided on the slide, or if you have any questions about where to find the policy, please don't hesitate to reach out. But one of the things people often miss in calculating the wages paid is within shred, there's certain things that you're allowed to include or not include. And so looking at that properly to make sure you get the most advantageous calculation. So it can include the salaries and wages plus any vacation pay. And we can also include certain bonuses and taxable benefits. So we can't include stock options, most retirement allowances, and certain payments to specified shareholders. We also can't include management fees, contract payments to independent contractors. And that's because those are treated as contractors, not as salaries and wages. And we can't claim non-taxable benefits. Those may be claimed as overheads, but ultimately, we would take, if you worked 100 hours on shred out of your 2,000 hour a year, take that times the wages paid, and that would give you your shred labor. One of the things that's often overlooked too is this total hours worked. And so often people consider a full year as 2,080 hours, but for shred, we only have to divide it by your total hours worked. So we can take out statutory holidays, if the company gives any other days off beyond the stats, and vacation. So if someone has, 4 weeks of vacation, and there's, let's say 11 stats here in Manitoba, those amounts can be removed from the denominator so that we actually are, when we take their hours worked for shred divided by their total hours, the percentage is actually higher than you might have calculated yourself if you forgot to remove those. Again, all of this is specifically called out in the salary and wages policy, which is quite in depth. We're only, the hours, when we're tracking hours, we're only allowed hours for eligible activities to be claimed. And there's this concept of directly engaged labor, or salaries for overhead. So if you choose, and we talk about overhead, I think a little later, but for overhead, you get to choose either proxy or the traditional method. The proxy method for overhead allows you to take your labor claimed for shred and increase it and claim 55% of it to cover all of your overheads. And in that case, you don't actually get to claim your overheads. You take the 55% of the labor to cover those. So then anything that is considered an overhead would no longer be eligible. The other method is the traditional method where you actually calculate all of your overheads directly related and incremental to the shred, and you are able to claim those overhead costs. So when you're time tracking, it's important to know the difference between these two methods, as the type of activities that are eligible are different. This is a table that is out of the T4088, which is a document that walks you through how to fill out the shred form. So we can provide a link to that. I'll even just make a note. Maybe we can provide some of the links we relied on as a separate document. But this is a CRA policy document on the types of activities that are eligible as directly engaged. Then there's activities that would be considered overhead, just to make note of those. And then there's some activities that they commonly see that are just not eligible. So when you're setting up a timesheet, you would want to look at documenting the time for experimentation analysis, all of your support work. If you have non-specialized employees, so shop floor employees who are operating the machine for the experiment, feeding the raw materials into that machine, if those non-specialized employees are being supervised by the staff with scientific or technological qualifications, that time can be claimed. Supervising the employees performing shred and overseeing your contracts from a shred technical perspective, so defining the technical scope of work for your contracts, that's eligible work. Your technological planning for shred projects in the year, so determining which engineers are going to work on it, what are their job priorities, what are the strategies, what are the quality of the materials that you're going to use in the prototypes, that's all eligible, as well as some of the feasibility studies for your shred projects and developing documents for internal use. So those are the type of time that you want to capture for shred. Any long-term planning, your human resources, the actual financial administration of shred contracts, training, preparing the actual shred forms, and then support from others in the business that are more clerical, so maintenance, accounting, etc. Those are eligible, but only as overhead. So if we are claiming the proxy method, these activities would not be eligible. And so you might want to track them so that you know, is that 55% of the time that is eligible, is that more than if I would have actually claimed my overhead expenditures? But I would say over 90% of our clients use the proxy method, and even when tracked, the proxy is less stress and an easier calculation and requires less tracking. Preparing user manuals and administrative training, so giving your employees training on cybersecurity or how not to click on email phishing, that type of work would just never be eligible. Ideally, this time is tracked in a timesheet, and I have some examples next. Policy does allow for cost allocation methods, and as a lot of things in shred, that's very nuanced. Estimates are not allowed. So if you say to the CRA, we estimated our time, that could lead to a disallowal of your claim. What is allowed is a cost allocation method. And so if you can break down your project into the activities that were performed and allocate time to those activities based on a reasonable assumption of what that time would take, that is allowed. And so you must be able to show that the method you used is based on a systematic approach and provides a reasonable level of accuracy. And what that could look like is, our design process involved 10 drawings. Each drawing takes about an hour. And Ren had 10 hours of drawing. And, the next day we tested our prototype. It was tested over the series of 2 weeks. We have test documents that show testing took place from 10 to 2, therefore 6 hours a day times this many days. This is the time being allocated. So, as a lot of things in shred, language matters. And so estimates versus allocations, if you don't have timesheets and you are making allocations of time, it is important that they're based on a methodology and that it is supported by the documentation that you do have in place in lieu of a timesheet. One other thing just to note is only one level of supervision is permitted. And so one of the things they'll ask for is your organizational chart. And so when we say that assignment of technological personnel and overseeing the personnel performing SR&ED is allowed, we're only allowed one level of supervision. So that could be the engineering manager who is not necessarily doing the technical work, but is the technical guidance and oversight for the project. We could not then also then claim if above the engineering manager, maybe there's a CTO and then there's a general manager, we cannot claim their time for supervision of personnel, only one level above those who are directly engaged in the work. That being said, it's not to say that your CTO or your general manager is not participating in some of these other activities, in which case, again, having their time tracked for that participation, we still can claim that time. This is some just really rough examples of like how a timesheet could look. So ideally, it might look like each day, the employees' names, what date, what were they working on, a little description of their activity, and then their hours worked. And ideally, their non-SR&ED time would also be documented. Now, their non-SR&ED time does not have to be documented at the same level of fidelity. It could literally be, that 20 hours in the week are SR&ED and it has activities, and then your other 20 hours are not SR&ED, and you could literally just put 20 hours not SR&ED. But having a full document of your time worked on SR&ED, non-SR&ED, and then the time not worked, that would be the gold standard for a timesheet. The other methodology would be to create a work breakdown structure for your project. And then, on a weekly or daily or weekly basis, or even monthly, have people populate, and maybe there's a spreadsheet for each individual, but 8 hours on background research, 12 hours on requirements definition, etc. And then we do see, this is a common method where we will use as an allocation method for our clients where they have not tracked time in the year, is creating this work breakdown structure. And then within it, again, like with the concept design and feasibility, ideally we could look into emails, look into meetings, and sort of show, that stage of the process was for January and February. There was 5 meetings a week, and use some sort of allocation method to fill in the blanks on a per person basis. One of the things that I often recommend is there's usually individuals on the team who are just lend themselves more to organization and documentation. And so if one individual even keeps this level of detail, when they say prototype testing, they might say prototype testing with, John, Jane, and like the others. And so if they keep good, if the person who is really good at this, if you ask them to kind of, write down who are they working with, what was being done, their timesheet then can be extrapolated to support the time of others. So especially where there's a project manager, and then you may use others from the business more sparingly, you might just then ask the main technical lead to be documenting the time for the others involved. Any questions on these timesheet examples, or what should be kept in a timesheet or not? So it is important to pay attention to the location of work. So work performed in Canada is what is eligible. On the provincial credit level, they do also want to know which province the work was performed in. You are allowed up to 10% of your total salaries for the project, or for the company, for the SR&ED claim, to be outside of Canada. So if people are traveling to the US or traveling to another company to perform a test, or to do some of the work, for example, maybe you field testing out with a US client, that it's not necessarily ineligible, but we're only allowed to claim up to 10% of the total salaries and wages outside of the country. So it's important to track that location of work and disclose that so that can be properly filled out on the form. Salaries must be paid within 180 days of year end, which for most companies, not a problem, but sometimes in startups, they accrue salaries and have agreements to pay them out later. But if you haven't made the payments within 180 days of the year end, for all of these cost categories, there is a special treatment of them to be considered, and you don't actually earn the tax credit in the taxation year until it's paid. but you do have to claim the expenditure in the period it's claimed. So it's a bit nuanced. So if you are in a situation where they're not paid by 180 days, I would say definitely reach out to a SR&ED consultant for assistance there. Make sure you're considering whether you've used the proxy or the traditional method for overhead. And if anyone is a specified employee where they own 10% or more of the business, it's important to pay attention to that, as there are some specific rules that apply. And bonuses. There is specific applicability of bonuses in the calculation of wages, but then also bonuses are not allowed in the calculation of proxy. So just something to be aware of. The documentation requirements would be to have T4s and payroll records, have that timesheets, time tracking reports showing time spent on SR&ED. Again, your project records, progress records, having an analysis of time on ineligible activities. So showing that, people spend time on marketing and that hasn't been claimed, that can be important. Having support for your salary calculations and the organizational chart. So the CRA may ask to see the job titles, the reporting structure, what their project role, and what are their educational background for the members involved in the project. So it's important to have that documentation. And so what this might look like in a CRA review is an ask for you to provide the scheduled calculations, the working papers behind, show the time that each employee spent working on the project, how was that calculated, explain how the amount of time that each employee spent working on the project was determined, what bonuses and taxable benefits are included in this. Please provide year-end payroll ledger for salaries and wages claimed. So in any of these slides where we say what this may look like in a CRA review, these are actual requests and the exact wording that we've received them in the initial audit requests that we've received from the CRA. So really just wanted to give you guys examples of, in an audit, what they might ask for. And this is usually at the first request before the meeting. They'll just ask for these documents for them to review before the meeting. So if there's no questions on materials, the next category is materials. There's no further question on labor. So materials can be consumed or transformed in SR&ED. And the calculation of the treatment of materials is the same whether you have traditional or proxy for your overhead. Any materials claimed must be part of the thing that is the SR&ED at a certain point in time, and you claim it at the time when it becomes the thing that is the SR&ED. And so, in the example of a prototype, if you order all of your materials 1 year, but you don't actually bolt them together and make the prototype until the next year, you actually would not claim them until they were issued to the project to become used in SR&ED. Supplies, so test tubes, beakers, buckets, mixing sticks, etc., are not considered materials for SR&ED, and so those are only eligible as overhead. And you can also include the unrecoverable taxes, such as the PST or some of the shipping and duty costs, as part of your material costs. So again, things that people might often miss in calculating the costs of their materials. And materials can be purchased from US or foreign suppliers. So the criteria is that they are used in the SR&ED in Canada. And so it does not matter where the invoice is from. So it's unique for this category of costs. They do ask on the SR&ED form, is it a material consumed or transformed? So consumed materials are those that are used up or rendered valueless in the course of the SR&ED. And it includes the loaded costs of the raw materials. So if you are using a produced material as part of your experiment, we can include the labor cost to have made that raw material, as well as the raw material costs. And these would be things that at the end of the year, they either have no value or they are being scrapped. Versus materials transformed are things like a prototype, which might still exist in its physical form even after it's been tested. And the importance for this is that materials transformed, because they have a retained value, if you ever sell it or change it to commercial use, there are specific recapture rules that apply. And so by claiming things as a material transformed, you do have an obligation to track those costs and whether or not they are converted to commercial use in the future. It's important for materials to have all of your purchase documentation, so invoices, receipts, the purchase orders, the receiving slips, or where there's internal production costs that went into that raw material, having those production costing records. Have your inventory and usage logs. So when did you withdraw it from inventory? When did you issue it to the project? If you're scrapping something or if you have costs to dispose of it, having copies of that. So your test failure records or showing the date of disposal, that's all very important. And evidence that the prototypes are not in commercial use. So in the old days, the CRA used to physically come for site tours. And so, you physically could show them that the prototypes were all sitting on a shelf or in the backyard. Right now, that might just look like, again, just a statement from yourself that a concurrence that they're not being used in commercial purposes. So in a CRA review, you might be asked to provide a detailed summary of the expenditures of materials transformed in performing shred and have the names of the suppliers, the date, the materials, the descriptions, and amounts. So for contractors, the contractors must be taxable Canadian suppliers, and we have to allocate between eligible and ineligible activities. So we have to look at that scope of work of what they're performing. If it's engineering in support of the eligible project, the whole invoice might be eligible, or there may be parts where only a portion of the contract is eligible. And so that is, documenting the type of activities that are being performed, having a really good statement of work, what's being asked of you, of the contractor, and what are they being asked to perform is really important, as well as having reporting on what they have done. It's important to note if they're an arm's length contractor versus non-arm's length. So if it's from a related party, there's just different rules that apply. So if I'll just finish the slide and then I'll answer your question, Kathy. So, and then it's important to know on whose behalf the shred is work is being undertaken. And this impacts whose shred it is to claim, especially when two Canadian companies are working together. We look at IP ownership, price risk, whether it's a service versus a product, and who has control over the work. So in the example of where a prototype's being used in beta testing and it was given to someone for use in testing, ideally, it's given to a Canadian for use in testing because the product has to be tested or it has to be used in testing in Canada. So if you make a prototype and you are giving it to a foreign customer for testing, we likely cannot claim those costs of the material and the prototype. If it's given to a Canadian customer at zero cost for the purpose of testing, that would be acceptable. So we can claim the prototype costs if it has not been sold. And we would want to show evidence that, the customer understands they are taking a prototype and what is the agreement for them to give back findings and data, etc. And then what happens to that prototype at the end? Are they returning it after testing, or is there a commercial benefit? If they've been given it at zero cost, it's been disposed of at zero cost. And so when we look at the recapture rules, there likely is no impact, but there is that just understanding of if it's ever converted to commercial use, understanding the impacts of that. But if you are giving it to someone to test, zero cost to a Canadian, that works out perfectly. In the case we have had in the past where, 50 prototypes and sort of half went into the US, half in Canada. So we were only able to claim costs for those that are used in testing in Canada. So for contractors, it's really important to have a contract in place. Lots of people do not. And so you're not alone if you haven't in the past, but it is important to have a contract, especially where small companies are working together. But it's important to have a contract to understand who owns the IP, what is being asked of you to perform, what is that scope of work? Are you being asked to perform shred, or are you being asked to provide a product? And the importance there is that if in the example of someone designing a new novel machine or process for you, if the contract is, I am buying one machine for $500,000 and that is what the customer is paying for, then there may not be any shred for them to claim on that $500,000 invoice. And that might be what you want. Whereas if you are contracting someone to design, experiment, and test and experimentally develop a prototype on your behalf, and you acknowledge that they are performing shred for you, that there is some risk that they results may not be achieved, maybe you're paying them on a time and material basis, that would protect your ability to claim the shred. And so in all cases, documenting what is the scope of the work, and when you're providing invoices, providing details on what are the activities that have been performed, and what are you invoicing for, will really help and go a long way in a CRA audit. So your invoices, and again, this seems obvious, but it's amazing how many times we see where it's not the case. Like your invoices should have dates, descriptions, locations of the work, be a numbered invoice, have your business numbers from the contractors where they're charging you any applicable taxes. And you should have evidence of proof of payment. So we often see in a CRA review, one of the very first questions they ask is for each contractor that's been named, provide a statement of the work done in the year and a description of each of the deliverables that they were obliged to provide to you. And so again, they're looking to not only validate that it's an eligible shred contract payment, but that you are eligible to claim for that contractor payment, especially where the other company is a Canadian entity. I know there had been originally some questions around like that one of the goals was to understand, as a contractor, how to document stuff. Does that answer it, or do you have any, anything specific on contracts that you'd like to understand? And again, happy to have a conversation around that, because it is understanding whose shred it is to claim, and if it is your customers, what documentation you can give to support that claim is very important. So happy to always have a more fact-based discussion at any time with no obligation, obviously. The final, or one of the, okay, whether or not to provide a receipt. Yeah, so you don't necessarily have to, so if they, we actually don't provide receipts. And one of the things that the CRA is auditing a lot right now is professional services. So it's totally unrelated to shred. But so we have had a few clients come back and say, hey, can you give me a retroactive proof of payment or receipt? Their requirement is usually to provide proof of payment. So when we're usually asked by CRA, we're usually providing like here's the check that went out, here's where it is in the general ledger, here's the e-transfer out of our bank account showing that it went to pay this invoice, and that's usually suffices. So you don't necessarily need to provide a receipt if, payments are being made in accordance with your invoice. Overhead costs are only eligible in a traditional method is selected, otherwise it's covered by that proxy. Overhead must be directly related to the prosecution of shred, which is sometimes hard to prove, and incremental, so that you would not have incurred this expense but for the shred. And so things like the internet line or the telephone costs or the electricity for the building, sometimes it's really hard to prove that you wouldn't have otherwise incurred those expenditures. And some of them, like rent, are a prescribed expenditure, which are not eligible for overhead. And so that is why most of the claimants do claim proxy, as calculating your exact overheads is a little bit of effort, and often is not as high of an amount as the proxy itself. One thing I would note is the proxy, you get 55% of the labor. It is capped at the actual overheads of the company. So there is, if you are a small entity where all you have is engineers performing shred, there is a chance that 55% of their labor exceeds all of the overheads in the business, and there is a cap there. So that is a very, again, specific area of policy that your accountant or shred consultant can assist with. But So in addition to each of the cost categories, this is where, again, a lot of errors get made is this other category. So there's, prescribed expenditures like your rent, bank payments, etc., which just are not eligible for SR&ED. Calculating the prescribed proxy amount. And so there are limits for owners and specified employees in calculating the amount of proxy. Also, while bonuses are allowed in the calculation for non-specified employees are allowed for wages, you have to remove them on the portion for when you're calculating proxy. So all these little nuances of policy that, where it is important to either read the policy yourself and be comfortable with it or involve a provider or your accountant in the calculations. The expenditures must be of a current nature. If any of the expenditures are unpaid after 180 days after the year end, or you think that they will be, they have to be treated separately. So you claim them and then you remove them from the claim in another line, which then allows you the ability to say next year, I've now paid these and I want the credit in association with them. So you do have to claim them when they were incurred. And so when either the labor was performed or the work was performed or the materials became part of the thing, you have to claim it then, even if you don't pay it till the next year. And again, it has to be treated separately on the form. If you make contributions, cash or in kind, to another a university or a research institute for access to their research, those are considered third-party payments. And again, there's separate treatment for those. If you are the contractor and you're being paid for the work, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't claim it as SR&ED. It just means that you have to treat the amounts that you've received from another Canadian entity as a contract payment. So if in performing your contract, you spent $200,000 in labor costs, but you only were paid $100,000 because you had a little bit of a risk there, you could claim SR&ED on your $200,000 and then remove the $100,000 you received as a contract payment. If you receive IRAP or other government funding, it's important that you remove that funding from your SR&ED calculations. There's a special line item on the form. IRAP and NRC funding, a lot of government programs, there's public disclosure of the grant recipients. And so one of the things we see is the CRA looking at the IRAP list of recipients before they come and audit you. And they will often know in advance, you received $250,000 for IRAP, please show us the supporting documentation and how this has been taken into consideration in your SR&ED claim. If you've worked with other businesses, that's to be disclosed. And again, it can impact the claiming of the expenditures if those are arm's length parties or even non-arm's length parties, so sister companies. And then it is important if you do use a SR&ED provider or claim preparer in any way, there is what's called the Part 9. It's the Part 9 of the SR&ED form where you have to disclose that you used a claim preparer. And there's actually that would be really high, $100,000. There's a $1,000 fee for not properly disclosing any payment or any involvement of a claim preparer as part of your filing. Sometimes claim preparers don't want to submit that information to your accountant. And so that can be filed separate from the tax return, but it does need to be filed. So once you've been through all of that, you're ready to sort of prepare the claim forms and then do the integration and filing. And so, we don't have a lot of information on these steps. This is where it really does become, working with your accountants to put the claims into your tax return. So the forms must be complete. It's very important that each and every applicable box is considered and, checked appropriately. If your 18-month deadline passes and something like you forgot to check you wanted proxy, there's no mechanism to change that after the 18-month deadline. And so they will just not allow you to have proxy. Or for example, if you, missed a line or etc. After that 18 months, there is no mechanism to change what has been submitted. If you do file current, so if you file in that first, immediately after your tax return, you do have up to 18 months to amend for SR&ED. And so if you do make errors, like in unintentional errors, there sometimes is that ability to correct them then. And so that's why it is important to claim timely. One of the things we see the CRA pointing out a lot right now is, as the taxpayer, you have to certify the tax return and the SR&ED forms to say that you certify that you've examined the information provided on this form and on the attachments, and it's true, correct, and complete. And so even where you've involved someone like ourselves to assist you in the claim preparation, you are ultimately taking responsibility for the accuracy of the claim. And so it's really important that you're working with a trusted consultant so that you are understanding of what has ultimately ended up in those calculations, as you are ultimately the one who is certifying that it's true. And in a situation where the CRA feels that there's fraud or gross negligence, like it would be your corporation who would, be fined or feel the penalty of that. So it is important that you have a full understanding of what has gone into the claim, and that you are comfortable with that. Once the claim is submitted, like the progress of the claim, you track that versus via My Business account. Most companies now have their My Business account set up, but it is, if you do not, I recommend that you do have that set up. And for SR&ED, the preferred communication is the telephone for the first communication. So, and a lot of the SR&ED reviewers, they all work from home, and so they are phoning from their CRA cell phones when they phone you. So that first communication can be, hi, I'm John Smith from the CRA and we're going to audit your claim. And it feels a little odd, and again, in the current environment where we're all concerned about scams, if you are at all concerned about that phone call, it is important to take the call. They often are not asking any sensitive information. They are telling you that they want to audit the claim, and their next form of communication will actually be an audit request letter that they upload to My Business account. But you can always phone the SR&ED inquiries line. The information, that number is available on the internet, but we can also provide a link to it. But you can phone the SR&ED inquiries line and say, hello, I received a call from this person. I just wanted to make sure that this is valid. But it is not odd to receive a call from just a random phone number and have it be a SR&ED auditor claiming that they are selecting your claim for review. But like I said, they will not ask any tax sensitive information, and it is more of a contact, but it is important to respond. And another key point is, if you have a refund coming your way, it's really important to set up direct deposit. The CRA otherwise will issue a check, which can get delayed. And if those checks are lost in the mail, or, sometimes people have their lawyers or accountants set up as their mailing address. And so it can really delay the amount of time it takes to receive that refund. So having direct deposit set up, making sure that your mailing address, your direct deposit information is all up to date and relevant is really important when you're making a SR&ED claim. It's also actually something that we didn't put here. The other thing that can delay the receipt of your SR&ED claim is your compliance on all of your other CRA accounts. So if you are overdue on payroll submissions, your GST is not up to date, etc., the CRA will hold your SR&ED refund and not issue it until you're in compliance for those other programs. And so it is important to make sure you're current with your other filings. Also, if you have amounts owing, let's say on a GST account that you haven't paid, they will reimburse themselves out of your refund before they issue a check. So in the unfortunate event you are selected for a CRA review, the initial contact will come via phone call. They will then upload the audit agenda and any pre-meeting information requests via My Business account. They often ask to schedule the meeting about 30 days out, and that gives you time to initially prepare those questions that you would have seen throughout the presentation. They will have asked, like, can I see how you calculated salaries? Give me a list of your materials. You will have some time to prepare that information and submit it to them before you actually have the audit meeting. These used to all be held in person, and currently they're all being held virtually, so via Teams. It's about 3 to 4 hour meeting that they usually ask to book. And after that meeting, you'll often come out with homework. We often say that even in the meeting, that if they're asking questions you don't know the answer to, you're better off taking it as homework and saying, my understanding is you would like to understand how the work was performed. Let me go prepare a summary, find some of the additional documents and I'll provide a submission to you with those details versus answering the question right on the spot. It gives you a chance to take a deep breath, actually consider what's being asked, and formulate a response with the supporting documentation. And the reason I say that is there's lots of things that in verbally responding to a question, you might say, oh, through a process of trial and error, we determined this. And they might latch on to that, where trial and error is defined in the SR&ED glossary as not attempting to understand how or why something was done, just a binary yes or no. And while that might not be what you meant, they might latch onto your language and then use that against you. And so it is a situation where, everything you say can and will be used against you. So selecting your words carefully, and when they ask questions that you're not sure the answer of, not being afraid to say, let me take that away and we'll prepare a response for you. So usually you'll have 30 days to submit any additional information that comes out of the meeting. And once they've had a chance to review that, they'll submit a proposal to you. The outcome can be that they accept the claim as filed and that all of the work is found to be SR&ED. That some of the work is SR&ED. So they will say what portions of the project that they feel are in alignment with the policy versus what portions they feel are ineligible activities. And they'll have a financial proposal along with that of then based on the technical scope of work finding, eligibility document, what is the financial implications of that. So when you receive that proposal, you do have 30 days to respond. And so the best mechanism, if you disagree, is to have further documentation or information as to why their opinion is incorrect. They only have the information that's been provided to them. They have not been working on this for years, as you may have been, and they are often not experts in your industry. So while you will receive a technical reviewer who has a science or technology background, in a recent review, we were, the area of science was, building envelope, energy efficiency, and the reviewer we had a PhD in chemistry. And so there can be gaps sometimes in their background with the area that you're trying to explain. And so sometimes when they come back with an initial negative outcome, it's important just to reflect on how they may have misinterpreted the facts and what additional information exists that you can provide to them to better advance their understanding. So you have the opportunity to respond to that proposal. Once they review your response, they will then finalize their findings, whether they agree or disagree. And so they may change their outcome or they may not. And then the file gets sent to tax processing and your notice of assessment is issued. And so once the notice of assessment is issued is where you will receive your refund, if applicable. So the next slide is sort of, let's say that all goes wrong. If you disagree with the CRA, and some of you, if you're talking to other companies over the years, the SR&ED program has been in place for many years. And so often we hear of these negative experiences that people have had with the program. So there are mechanisms to resolve disputes with the CRA throughout the process. So in the review, I would say immediately, if you don't feel that the reviewer is understanding the area of technology or what you're explaining, that immediately to discuss those concerns with the RTA or the financial reviewer or their managers, and not be afraid to involve their managers, as sometimes that can be what gets you a better successful outcome. If when you receive the proposal, you don't feel like you've been given due process and you don't feel that the claim has been conducted in alignment with the requirements or that your taxpayer rights have not been overseen, you can request an administrative review. So this is still during the review process. After you receive your proposal, but before the review is finalized, there is a special form that you can fill out to request an administrative review. And this goes to the actual SR&ED program team. It goes to the regional manager or regional director to review and determine if they would maybe give you a new reviewer, overturn the reviewer's findings, or uphold the result. And again, it's just one of the maybe lesser known options to attempt to resolve a dispute earlier on. Once you received your notice of assessment, your only methods, if you don't agree with the findings, are to file a notice of objection. So that has to be filed 90 days after you receive your notice of assessment. So it must be filed 90 days. And you file your objection. And then if that process is unsuccessful, and that process takes over a year, so it is not fast in any way, shape, or form. What that looks like is your file being assigned to appeals officer, and then you'll be assigned a technical reviewer again, but out of the appeals division. And so they will review the file to see if they agree with the findings. You sometimes have the opportunity to speak with the appeals officer and explain to them why you disagree. And then again, they will make a decision if they will overturn or uphold the original findings. If that is unsuccessful, you still have the mechanism to appeal to the Tax Court of Canada. And that can also be settled or go right through to an actual tax court finding, which would be similar to the ones that we provided the link to, where you can read how others have made out in tax court. That is a very lengthy process. We had a situation where a client of ours, we just went through the tax court process, and it resulted in a settlement, and it was for taxation years ending in 2015, 2016. So, and this was just resolved sort of fall this year. And that would be similar timeframes if you look at the court cases on that SciTax website, the ones that are being posted where findings have been recently issued, often have to do with taxation years back 2015, 16, 17, 18 at the state. So hopefully you're never in these situations. And if you have proper documentation, it'll go a long way to resolving concerns before they even come into play. So that I did leave a lot of time today hoping for some questions so that I do have space to answer those. So I did leave a bit more buffer than I had in the past, but so that's sort of the end of our presentation. We have in our slides our contact information, but obviously too, WTC and Mia will have copies of the slides and they can always get us in touch. Happy in the time that's remaining to take any questions or provide any, if there's any areas where anyone would like a little bit more information.
People can also unmute themselves if they feel comfortable enough to take their mics off. So if you have any questions, you could do so as well.
I will say that, even after 11 years of exclusively doing SR&ED, there's still a lot of maybe, what if, let's look, and so, if you feel frustrated by the nuances in the program, you're not alone. A reputable SR&ED provider would be happy to address those concerns and chat through that, without obligation and be able to give you good information. So don't hesitate to reach out at any time. And it is a very technical area. And my objective today was to try to get one level deeper than what you would normally get in just sort of that what is SR&ED, where, you still leave just wondering what is a technological uncertainty. Well, someone in the comments said that your presentation was excellent and very informative. So I think you did a great job explaining everything. I think maybe that's why people don't have as many questions. Perfect. We'll go with that, and not that it's a boring topic.
Yeah, no. Very well done, Andrea.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Very well done.
Yeah, and like I said, happy always to answer questions. I know how frustrating it is to be on the other side. I in my first 10 years of my career, I was an engineer claiming SR&ED for projects that I was working on, and it's hard. We often say to our clients, we know it's other duties as assigned when we assign them homework to give us information on their projects, and so I can appreciate there's no time in the day, and it hasn't been allotted for in your project budgets. And so, if you are working with the right partner, they do strive to make that as easy as possible for you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, I don't think there are any other questions, but I think you included your contact information. So if people want to reach you, they can do so as well. I also included some webinars and events, both from MEIA and WTC Winnipeg in the comment section. So thank you to everybody who joined the webinar, and then thank you, Andrea, again, for having delivered this presentation. But yeah, we will see you hopefully online soon. Excellent. Thank you all. Take care, everybody.